It's getting darker, colder. The nights are drawing in and everyone gathers round the fire for a story. You're probably cuddled up under a blanket with a hot chocolate and wanting to hear some folk tales. Well, luckily for you, I wrote a whole book of them, so I'm going to spend some time reading you folk tales from my book. Now, our first story is about a rather jovial monk from York named Brother Jucundus. As the story goes, he was a fat, jovial monk who always loved good food and plenty of it. Why he became a monk was never known, but after years of simple food and not much of it, he began to pine for his old life. He lived at St. Leonard's Priory, which was right next door to St. Mary's Abbey. One day he was in bed when he heard the sounds of a fair outside. He decided that he had to escape and join in the fun outside. He stole some money from the alms box and crept out of the priory. He had immense fun at the fair, eating, drinking, and sat on a seesaw singing In Dulci Jubilo, up, up, up we go, as he went up and down. But his revelry was broken when he spotted two monks from the priory watching him. He careened off the seesaw, singing In Dulci Jubilo, down, down, down we go. The monks quickly picked him up, placed him in a wheelbarrow, and took him back to the monastery. There he received a good telling off from the prior, for he had clearly broken the rules of the monastery. When asked to defend himself, Brother Jucundus, having consumed a good quantity of ale, simply fell back into the wheelbarrow and started singing In Dulci Jubilo again. This was enough. His actions had brought shame on the monastery. He was sentenced to death. The monks led him down to the cellar, with Jucundus obliviously singing Down, down, down we go as they went. They put him in a cellar and gave him bread and water before starting to brick up the wall. Soon the cellar was bricked up from floor to ceiling, and Jucundus was surely to die in his little cell. When they had all gone, he started throwing himself against the wall, and miraculously it gave way. He tumbled into St. Mary's Abbey next door. But little did he know that if life was bad in St. Leonard's, it was much worse in St. Mary's. They kept silent for 364 days of the year. They were only allowed to speak on Easter Sunday, and so nobody asked him any questions. His bed was harder, the food was smaller and tasteless, and soon it began to lose the chubbiness it had in St. Leonard's. A year later, the monk in charge of the cellar died, and Jucundus was given his role. When the fair came round again, this time he couldn't go out, but instead crept into the cellar and helped himself to the finest communion wine. He had one glass, then another, and soon lost count of how many glasses he had had. Meanwhile, the monks were impatiently waiting upstairs for their daily ration of ale. The abbot, furious, strode into the cellar to find Brother Jucundus laying against a cask of wine and merrily swinging his glass in the air as he sang, In Dulci Jubilo, up, up, up we go. Though it was not Easter Day, the offence was so great that it warranted a breaking of the vow of silence. It was quickly agreed that Jucundus was to be excommunicated and bricked up in the cellar to die. There was a convenient hole in one of the walls and a great deal of loose stone, so they put him in and bricked up the wall, giving him bread and water. But Jucundus just kept singing merrily. At the same time, a monk from his old monastery was in the cellar to collect some wine when he heard Jucundus singing. He froze. Jucundus had been dead for a year. He rushed up to the rest of the monks, who were grieving for the prior who had recently died. They reluctantly followed him into the cellar, where they too heard the singing. They couldn't believe it. They raced for pickaxes and began to demolish the wall, and there, to the wonder and amazement of all, was Brother Jucundus. It was a miracle. With one united voice, the monks proclaimed Jucundus as a new prior, and he lived out the rest of his days in happiness and peace. Our next story is just one in the wide canon of stories about knights, dragons, scaly armour and dogs. But this one has a very tragic ending. This is a story of the dragon of Lushi Wood. As the story goes, there once lived a great dragon in Lushi Wood near Nunnington. It terrorised the villages and slew many knights who tried to kill it. One day, a knight named Peter Lushi, with his trusty dog, came to the village. He went to the blacksmith and ordered a set of armour which had spikes and sharp blades all over the outside. He approached the dragon, and when it tried to wrap its long body around him and squash him like a boa constrictor, it cut itself on his armour. However, no matter how many times Peter stabbed it, the dragon only needed to roll on the ground and it would be healed. It was then that he whistled for his dog, so that whenever he chopped off a limb, the dog would pick it up and carry it away. In this way, the dragon could not heal itself, and soon the entire dragon had been chopped up into little bits and slain. The dog leapt up and licked the knight's face, but, unbeknownst to him, the blood of the dragon was poisonous, and Peter soon died. His dog died of a broken heart soon afterwards, and in the church at Nunnington there is a tomb of a knight in armour, with a dog at his feet. Our next story is not really a story, but a record of an unusual event that happened in the village of Skinningrove in 1535, when they were visited by a merman. Old men that would be loath to have their credit cracked by a tale of a stale date report confidently that 60 years since, or perhaps 80 or more, a seaman was taken by the fishers of that place, where during many weeks they kept in an old house, giving him raw fish to eat, for all other fare he refused. Instead of voice, he shrieked, and hewed himself courteous to such as flocked far and near to visit him. Fair maids were welcomest guests to his harbour, whom he would behold with a very earnest countenance, as if his phlegmatic breath had been touched with a spark of love. One day, when the good demeanour of this new guest had made his hosts secure of his abode with them, he privily stole out of doors, and ere he could be overtaken recovered the sea, whereinto he plunged himself. Yet, as one that would not unmannily depart without taking his leave, from the middle upwards he raised his shoulders often above the waves, and making signs of acknowledging his good entertainment to such as beheld him on the shore, as they interpreted it, after a pretty while he dived down, and appeared no more. Now, where would we be without a good ghost story? The ghost of Catherine Griffith, who died in 1620 at Burton Agnes Hall, was said to haunt the building. As the story goes, Anne had watched over the construction of the house and was determined to make it the most beautiful house ever built. When it was nearly finished, she went to visit the St. Quintin family at Harpham. They have a few stories connected themselves. But near St. John's Well, she was attacked and robbed. She was brought back to Burton Agnes, but died a few days later of her injuries. Before she died, she told her sisters that she would never rest unless part of her could remain in the house. She made them promise that when she died, her head would be cut off and preserved in the hall, so she could keep watch over it. The sisters agreed, but only to pacify her, and when Anne died, they buried her in the churchyard instead. The ghost of Anne began to haunt the hall, and the sisters eventually agreed to exhume the body and remove the skull. It was brought into the house, and since then the hall has not been haunted. Each time that the skull has been removed, however, the ghost has haunted the house. At some point it was built into the walls, though nobody knows for sure where, forever watching over the beautiful hall. Now, I know you want to end on a rather ghoulish note, so this last story is based on a real event the Calvary Hall murders in 1604, which were immortalised in a play 4 years later called A Yorkshire Tragedy, erroneously attributed to William Shakespeare. Walter Calvary had, in 1604, murdered his 2 children before attempting to murder his wife, who only survived because the metal in her corset deflected his knife. He was caught whilst trying to escape and executed at York by being crushed between large stones. After his execution, it was said that his ghost could be seen galloping around the Calvary estate on a headless horse, accompanied by other ghosts and running down any unfortunates who happened to be in their way. These ghosts became so troublesome that the local vicar was driven to exorcising them, which seemed to work for a time, but they soon reappeared. A preacher in the 18th century, while staying at the hall, recorded the following encounter. "I had not been asleep long before I thought something crept up to my breast, pressing me much. I was greatly agitated and struggled hard to awake. In this situation, according to the best judgment I could form, the bed seemed to swing as if it had been slung in slings, and I was thrown out on the floor. When I came to myself, I soon got on my knees and returned thanks to God that I was not hurt. Committing myself to his care, I got into bed the second time. After lying for about 15 minutes, reasoning with myself whether I had been thrown out of bed or whether I'd got out in my sleep, to satisfy me fully on this point, I was clearly thrown out a second time from between the bedclothes to the floor by just such a motion as before described. I quickly got on my knees to pray to the Almighty for my safety and to thank him that I was not hurt. After this I crept under the bed to feel if there was anything there, but I found nothing. I got into bed for the 3rd time. I had not lain a minute before I was thrown out of bed a 3rd time." I hope you've enjoyed hearing just a few of the stories collected in this book. If you'd like to read more, it's available in local bookshops and online. Good night.